Before a stunned crowd of 12 million, Jasmine Crockett corners Justice Samuel Alito with hard evidence, $170,000 in undisclosed luxury trips, gifts, and favors, all from people with cases before his court. When she leans in and asks, "Do you serve the Constitution or a political cult?" Alito goes dead silent. No defense, no denial. Just the sound of a Supreme Court justice crumbling on live TV. What exactly did Jasmine say that made the most powerful judge in America drop his mask? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in room 2141 burned harsh and clinical, casting long shadows across the polished oak table. At its center sat a thick, overstuffed report, 619 pages titled in bold, "Justice or Privilege." The air was tense, like the moment before a verdict. No one spoke. No one moved. Cameras tracked every breath. Then came the sharp click of heels, measured, unshaken. Jasmine Crockett entered, eyes forward, spine straight, dressed in stark black, like a warning, not a morning. She didn't glance at the crowd. She didn't need to. She was the crowd's voice now, focused, fueled, and unforgiving. Seconds later, Justice Samuel Alito made his entrance. His presence oozed entitlement, the kind that had never been questioned. He didn't sit. He settled into the chair like a monarch returning to his throne. With a slight smirk, he scanned the room and said, "Let's not confuse politics with law. This is performance art." Not a single senator spoke. The seats opposite him remained empty until Jasmine moved. She pulled back the chair slowly, deliberately, every motion silent but screaming. Sitting down, she stared into Alito's eyes, unblinking. "No," she said, her voice low but cutting. "This isn't theater. This is a reckoning. And today, this seat belongs to the people you've tried to silence." Alito leaned back, but the room had already shifted. And when the silence returned to room 2141, dense, electric, crackling with the weight of everything just said, Jasmine didn't let it fade. She harnessed it, let it hang just long enough to pull every heartbeat into sync. Then she leaned in, her voice lower now, quieter, but unmistakably sharper. "You want to know when I first heard your name, Justice Alito?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "It wasn't in law school. It wasn't in a courtroom. It wasn't even on the news. At least not the way you think." She paused, letting the air go still again. "It was in a kitchen, a small kitchen with peeling linoleum floors and one window that faced nothing but a brick wall. My mother was standing at the sink, dish in hand, watching the television when the Dobbs decision came down. And when your name was announced as the author of that opinion, the one that erased Roe, my mother dropped the plate she was holding. It shattered, and so did something inside her." Jasmine stood now slowly, as if the memory itself deserved the respect of full posture. She didn't cry like women cry in movies. There wasn't drama, there wasn't screaming, there was just this terrible, quiet collapse. Her face crumpled, like she'd just been told someone had died. And in a way, she had. She'd spent her youth fighting for something she believed I would never have to. And with one stroke of your pen, you brought that fight back into our home, uninvited, unearned, and absolutely unforgivable. Jasmine's voice didn't waver, but her jaw tightened. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I thought we had more time." The courtroom didn't move, not a shuffle, not a breath. "That was the day I learned your name, not from a ruling, from a wound." She let that memory hang for just a second longer, then exhaled, not to release the pain, but to make room for the truth that followed. "And maybe that's the clearest picture of who we are," Jasmine said, eyes fixed on Alito. "You were born into corridors of power that taught you the law was yours to shape. I was born into neighborhoods where the law was a warning sign." She straightened the folder in front of her, its spine frayed from use. "You sit on the highest court in the country, surrounded by clerks, marble, and silence. I come from a home where silence meant fear, and decisions like yours echo loudest in homes like mine." Her voice grew firmer, not louder, like something forged. "You were educated in ivy-covered buildings where doors opened before you even knocked. I went through public schools with broken heaters and overworked teachers who taught us that justice wasn't designed for girls like me, but we had to chase it anyway. She paused, letting that land. You write rulings behind closed chambers. I write legislation in rooms full of people who still don't believe I belong there. She gestured toward the hearing room. You've never had to defend your seat. I've had to earn mine every single day. And then, without breaking gaze, she delivered the truth like a blade wrapped in velvet. You protect a system built to serve the privileged. I fight for the people it was built to forget. She didn't break eye contact, didn't even blink. She simply lifted a small remote from the folder beside her and spoke with a calm that was far more dangerous than anger. Let's move from memory to fact, Jasmine said, her voice steady, deliberate. Because unlike my mother, some people have never had to worry about the law failing them. Some people fly above it, literally. The lights dimmed slightly and the massive screen behind her flickered to life. What appeared wasn't speculation. It wasn't commentary. It was video. The first scene, a sleek Gulfstream jet landing on a narrow airstrip cut through the Alaskan snow. The camera zoomed, time-stamped 2008 FAA records confirmed. Next, a panoramic shot of a luxury fishing lodge, $1,000 per night, no press allowed, guests by invitation only, and then the freeze frame that turned the room to stone. Justice Samuel Alito, standing ankle-deep in crystal water, fishing rod relaxed at his side, smiling beside billionaire hedge fund titan Paul Singer, both wearing matching waders and the kind of carefree ease that only comes when consequences are for other people. Jasmine let the image linger, then clicked again. The screen now showed a new document, stamped with the seal of the U.S. Supreme Court, the title in bold, Case Dockets Involving Paul Singer or Affiliated Entities, 2008 to 2021. 10 lines, 10 different cases. Her voice returned, calm but sharp. Paul Singer, the man who paid for your flight, hosted you in Alaska, provided lodging, meals, and proximity, is directly tied to at least 10 cases that came before this court. In all 10, you participated. In all 10, you voted in ways that benefited his financial empire. She stepped forward, the click of her heel the only sound in the chamber. No disclosure, no recusal, just decisions that reshaped international debt markets, sovereign immunity, and enforcement authority. Rulings that made billions for the man who invited you fishing. Her next words were slower, lower. And do you know what the public got from that weekend? Nothing. Not even a line in your financial disclosure report. She placed the remote down like a gavel. Justice Alito, you didn't just break public trust. You turned blind justice into a private arrangement. The room was silent. No one moved. And for the first time since the hearing began, Alito didn't smirk. Because this wasn't politics. It wasn't performance. It was proof. And it had teeth. The screen dimmed to black, but the image of Alito standing beside Paul Singer still lingered, etched now not in pixels, but in the minds of everyone watching. The silence held for another breathless second before the man himself finally spoke. His fingers interlaced loosely, his tone measured but unmistakably condescending. There is nothing unlawful about friendship, he said, each syllable slow and deliberate. We went fishing. That's all. His voice carried no shame, no hesitation, just the calm of someone who had lived his entire life above consequence. I did not hide anything. It was a personal trip, a perfectly legal one. He paused, eyes glancing toward the press gallery, as if to remind the cameras and the country that he wasn't afraid. Then came the kicker. Just because a man takes time to enjoy nature doesn't mean he's for sale, Alito said, his mouth twitching into a faint, hollow smile. Frankly, Congresswoman, I find it troubling that simple leisure is now treated like corruption. He adjusted the nameplate before him, as though the gravity of the evidence could be dismissed with posture alone. And just like that, he tried to collapse the issue into absurdity. Reduce 10 votes, billions in impact, years of silence, and the erosion of public trust into a weekend with a fishing rod. But what stunned the room wasn't just the defense. It was the way he delivered it. No acknowledgement of the power imbalance, no recognition of the optics, No understanding that when a Supreme Court justice takes a luxury trip paid for by a billionaire with business before the court, it's not just about what's legal, it's about what's just. And in that moment, every working American watching from home, every single mother denied a hearing, every veteran denied an appeal, saw the truth clearer than any ruling could print. Some men don't need to break the law because the system was built to move quietly out of their way. And as Alito's defense crumbled into the silence it left behind, Jasmine didn't press. She didn't need to. The truth was already doing the work. She turned to the chair beside her, eyes narrowed with quiet resolve. "We now call our next witness," she said, the words landing like a match in dry grass. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Then came the low groan of the back door opening, slow, deliberate, as a figure stepped into view. They wore a plain black suit, hands tightly folded, and a lapel microphone that had been altered to distort their voice. No cameras were allowed to show the face. On the placard, former Supreme Court legal clerk, 2010 to 2015. The witness sat visibly tense but controlled, the kind of restraint that comes not from fear, but from years of knowing what not to say. "I worked directly under Justice Alito for 3 years, the voice began, modulated, calm, but unmistakably human. "I reviewed filings, drafted early-stage memos, managed ethics briefings. In 2012, I flagged a conflict involving Paul Singer, specifically his financial stake in a sovereign debt case on our docket." They reached into a folder and placed a copy of the original warning memo onto the desk. That memo never reached the full ethics committee. It was intercepted, removed from the internal chain. You could hear the shift in the room, not noise, but presence, the kind of collective awareness that something irreversible was being said. Several of us raised similar concerns, quietly, carefully, because we understood the climate. We were told not to challenge the integrity of the bench or risk jeopardizing our futures in law. The witness paused. One hand trembled slightly, then clenched. But integrity isn't silence. And what I saw wasn't impartiality. It was insulation. The institution wasn't just ignoring the warnings. It was burying them. By now, the atmosphere had changed. No longer procedural, no longer political. This was personal, because it was proof that the rot wasn't abstract. It had a paper trail. It had witnesses. It had names. Senators stared ahead, unmoving. Reporters lowered their phones. The witness finished with a single sentence, delivered without emotion, but with impact that no headline could soften. Justice Alito wasn't protected because he was innocent. He was protected because acknowledging his guilt would have shattered the illusion of the court itself. No one spoke, because everyone in that room knew. The illusion had just cracked. The air hadn't settled from the witness's final statement. You could still feel the truth echoing in the bones of the room. But Jasmine didn't let it rest. She stepped forward again, not with aggression, but with a composure that felt like pressure building behind reinforced glass. "Now," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "we need to talk about something even more dangerous than silence. Symbols." She reached into the side pocket of her binder, pulling out a photograph mounted on thick board. With the same stillness as a judge handing down a sentence, she flipped it face up onto the table. The image hit like a breach in the dam. Projected behind her in high resolution was a color photo, date stamped January 17th, 2021. A lakeside property in Virginia, registered under the Alito family trust. But the focus wasn't the house, it was what fluttered just above the porch. A white flag with a pine tree and the words, "Appeal to Heaven." The same flag carried by mobs as they stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. The same symbol now associated with Christian nationalism, political extremism, and calls to overthrow democratic institutions. Jasmine let the image sit there, uninterrupted. She didn't need to add drama. The truth was doing that on its own. "This wasn't a mistake," she said, each word measured and precise. "This wasn't a child's prank. This wasn't the wind catching the wrong fabric. This flag, at this property, wasn't an accident. It was a statement." She turned her gaze directly to Alito. "And it was flown while the country was still mourning 5 dead Americans, while this very court was preparing to hear cases tied to that insurrection." She took a breath, not to pause, but to cut deeper. You are not just a legal figure, Justice Alito. You are a constitutional gatekeeper. And when a man in your position flies a flag connected to the most violent attack on our democracy in modern history, he is not just expressing an opinion. He is compromising the very credibility of this institution. Her voice didn't tremble, but it tightened. This flag has been co-opted by those who no longer believe in elections, who see law not as protection, but as an obstacle. And when they saw it flying above your house, they saw confirmation, permission. She turned to the room, not just the lawmakers, but the cameras, the public. This isn't about partisan politics. It's about perception. It's about power. It's about whether the highest court in this land still stands on neutral ground, or if it has been quietly, comfortably claimed by those who think the Constitution is theirs alone. Her last line was delivered like a closing argument, not shouted, but seared into every ear in the room. When symbols of insurrection fly from the homes of Supreme Court justices, the crisis isn't outside these walls anymore. It's inside them. No one moved, and in that silence, America was watching, not to see what she would say next, but to see how anyone could possibly answer. The flag on the screen behind her didn't need further explanation. Its message was clear, its meaning unavoidable. But Jasmine didn't look at the photo. She looked directly at the man who had let it fly, who now sat under oath before a country questioning whether the guardians of justice still knew what justice meant. Her voice was low but piercing. "Justice Alito," she said, her tone like flint against stone. "Do you serve the Constitution, or do you serve a political faith masquerading as patriotism?" It wasn't theater. It was indictment. The question didn't accuse. It demanded ownership. And in the span of a breath, the courtroom watched something shift, not in Jasmine, but in him. Alito's shoulders stiffened, his lips pressed together into a line too tight to be neutral. He leaned forward, not to assert, but to defend, for the first time all day. His voice broke through the silence with sudden force. "That," he said louder than necessary, "is a personal matter. That is my household, my wife, my family. It has nothing to do with my conduct on this bench." But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Too fast, too brittle, too rehearsed to be convincing. His composure, once ironclad, had cracked under the weight of a single question. His hands, once folded in calm, now gripped the edge of the desk like a man holding on to authority not by right, but by instinct. And in that moment, Jasmine didn't need to speak again. The chamber saw what she had come to reveal, that beneath the layers of legal tradition, beneath the solemn robe and centuries-old bench, sat a man unwilling or unable to answer whether his highest loyalty belonged to the people or to something far narrower, far more dangerous. And suddenly, the issue wasn't about a flag anymore. It was about whether the robe could still be trusted. The courtroom hadn't yet recovered from Alito's angry denial. His voice had cracked under pressure. His polished veneer had slipped. Just enough. But Jasmine didn't respond with fury. She responded with control. That was always her weapon. Not volume, not chaos, but precision. So she turned away from Alito, calmly, as if his answer had been expected, and addressed the panel with a composed clarity that cut sharper than any accusation. "Members of this committee, I'd like to enter into the record a piece of audio, verified, time-stamped, and submitted under seal, until now." The lights dimmed slightly as a technician moved swiftly to cue the file. No image appeared, just a glowing waveform, oscillating gently against a black screen. Jasmine stepped back from the mic and folded her hands. This was recorded at a private fundraising retreat, February of last year. Location, Napa County. The speaker you're about to hear was not under oath, but he was surrounded by political donors, clergy, and key figures tied to cases pending before this court. She let that linger for a moment. Then came the first unmistakable syllable. Alito's voice, clear, unfiltered, the voice of a man who did not expect history to be listening. "Let's stop pretending this is about neutrality. The other side plays for keeps. We don't have the luxury of sitting this out anymore." The room shifted. Subtle movements. A turned head, a clenched jaw. A pen paused halfway through a line of notes. We're not just interpreting laws now. We're defending the foundation of the country, the real one, the one we grew up believing in. Then a long pause on the tape. You could hear faint laughter in the background, clinking glasses, the gentle hum of wealth and comfort. This is a culture war, and it's time we stop being ashamed of it. We're right. They're wrong, and we have to win. That final line didn't echo. It detonated. The audio stopped. The waveform collapsed into silence. But the silence in the chamber didn't follow. It deepened. It hardened into something heavy. Something you could feel pressing into the walls of the room. Alito didn't move. His jaw clenched. His lips pressed into a thin line of defiance. But he said nothing. Because what could he say? This wasn't opinion. This wasn't someone else's spin. This wasn't a smear. It was him, on record, drawing battle lines from behind the robes of neutrality. Jasmine stepped forward again, this time slower. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from volume. It came from knowing the truth would carry its own weight if delivered without fear. That, she said quietly, is the voice of a man who sits in judgment over the lives of 330 million Americans. A man who has sworn an oath, not to any movement, not to any ideology, but to the Constitution. And yet, in that room, he wasn't defending the rule of law. He was declaring allegiance to a faction. She turned her attention to the senators arrayed before her, but her words were meant for the country beyond these walls. What happens when a Supreme Court justice no longer sees himself as a jurist, but as a soldier in a cultural holy war? What happens when us versus them becomes the framework for interpreting the Constitution, for deciding who gets a right and who gets a ruling? No one interrupted. Not the chairman, not the opposition. No one dared. She continued. The danger here is not in the audio alone. It's in the fact that it confirms what so many Americans already suspect, that the bench is no longer blind, that it no longer weighs equally, that its decisions are shaped, not by impartial reasoning, but by private convictions voiced behind closed doors to people who write checks and expect outcomes. Her tone dropped but sharpened. When we allow justices to speak like generals, we turn the court into a weapon. And once that happens, it stops being the last guardrail of democracy and becomes part of the crash. The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was loaded, tense. Even the cameras seemed to refocus. The microphones more sensitive now, as if every breath mattered. And Alito, usually unmoved, usually master of the poker face, was visibly off balance. His knuckles whitened against the desk. He looked at Jasmine, but not with authority, with something closer to calculation, as if he were trying to measure whether the next word would make it worse. She didn't give him the chance. Justice Alito, she said, now turning back to him fully. You were not elected. You were appointed. You do not represent a party. You represent a principle that above all ideologies, above all tribes, above all politics, this nation is governed by laws written not to serve one group, but to protect all. She took one final step forward, locking eyes with him. So I ask you again, when you say we must win, who exactly is we? Because millions of Americans who do not share your faith, your politics, or your privilege also stand before your court. And they don't need you to win. They need you to listen. The room didn't erupt. It recoiled, like a lung taking in cold air after smoke. Because it wasn't just about the recording, it was about everything it confirmed. The private truths behind public robes. The suspicion that decisions weren't just being written, they were being weaponized. Outside the chamber, newsrooms were already shifting tone. Headlines changed. Anchors stopped hedging. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. And in the center of it stood a single, unbroken voice. A congresswoman, a black woman, a daughter of Texas, who had dared to ask whether the scales of justice had been quietly tilted by the very hands sworn to hold them level. The room hadn't breathed since the recording ended. The silence was no longer stunned. It was structural. It pressed against the walls like pressure before a quake. Then Alito leaned forward, his voice sharp, forced through clenched teeth. The calm he had clung to all morning was gone. "You think one edited recording makes you qualified to question this court?" he said, each word louder than the last. "You're a first-term congresswoman. You haven't even finished a full cycle. You don't get to stand there and act like you understand the law better than someone who's spent decades upholding it." His words weren't legal reasoning. They were rank, a reminder, a punishment, and a warning. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away. She absorbed the blow without flinching, not because it didn't cut, but because it had cut before, many times, from men like him, from courts like his. She rose slowly without anger, as if carried by something older than pride, something closer to truth. "You're right," she said, voice even, clear. "I haven't been here long. I haven't written any opinions that reshaped federal doctrine. I haven't sat on high benches or in private planes. I wasn't born into power. I earned my way here, one door at a time, most of them closed before I knocked." She reached down and retrieved a folder, thinner than the reports on the table, but worn at the edges like it had been carried for years. Her hands didn't shake as she opened it. Her voice didn't rise. "But I do understand the law, Justice Alito. Not from above, not from behind oak desks and ivory chambers. I understand it from below, from the ground floor, where it lands when it's misused, where it breaks things that don't get repaired." She placed a single document on the table, sliding it forward so the cameras could capture it. "This is the federal indictment filed against my mother in 1996. A false charge. Wrong name, wrong record, right ZIP code. The kind of error that doesn't happen to people with lawyers on speed dial." She tapped the corner of the paper gently, like a reminder. "She served 5 years for something she didn't do. Lost her job, her housing, her voice. I was 12. I watched the law take everything from a woman who taught me how to read." The room had gone motionless. Even the court reporters had stopped typing. She didn't get a hearing like this. She didn't get national coverage. She didn't get mercy. She got precedent. From a ruling your court refused to revisit, because the mistake didn't rise to the level of constitutional violation. Jasmine looked directly at him now, and there was no contempt in her eyes, only memory. When she came home, it was in silence, not because she was guilty, but because the system had already decided what people like her were worth. Her voice grew firmer. "So no, I may not know what it feels like to write the law, but I know exactly what it feels like to live under it, to live with it, to carry its weight without any shield. And I know what it means when that law forgets the people it was meant to protect." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice didn't tremble. It landed. "I understand the law, Justice Alito, because it tried to erase the woman who raised me, because it tried to teach me that silence was safer than resistance, and because I had to fight for every right your rulings tried to place just out of reach." There was no applause, no need for it. The moment wasn't built for victory, it was built for truth, and she had delivered it, clean and exact. And in that truth, the robe across from her suddenly looked a little thinner. The folder still sat on the desk, its pages stained by time, by injustice, by memory. Jasmine's fingers rested on it for only a moment before she closed it gently, as if tucking away her mother's pain so it wouldn't be trampled by the next wave of truth. And then she looked up, not just at Alito, but at the room, at the nation behind the cameras. Her voice, when it returned, was different now, not wounded, not impassioned, surgical. "Now," she said with quiet gravity, "let's talk about something far less personal, but far more public." She reached for a second binder, thicker, pristine, wrapped in a navy blue cover stamped with a gold seal. "Internal Revenue Disclosures, SUP, Yeronaki-related entities, 2007 to 2023. She opened it with the care of someone unsealing a vault and the confidence of someone who already knew what was inside. "This," she said, lifting the first page, "is what you didn't disclose." A projector clicked on behind her, and the screen came alive, not with theory or argument, but receipts. First, a catering invoice from an exclusive Napa retreat, $18,420 for a weekend dinner attended by less than a dozen people. Justice Alito's name was among the RSVP list, written in cursive by the event planner. Then a hotel ledger, $7,800 for a 3-night stay at a private mountain estate, paid not by the justice himself, but by a private foundation tied to Paul Singer's legal advocacy fund. Then came the jet fuel charges, $42,000 for a round trip from D.C. to Jackson Hole, split between 2 undisclosed donors, one of whom had appeared before the court the following term. Jasmine flipped the page. Private transportation, wine shipments, custom cufflinks embossed with the initials SA, a gift, according to the internal memo, from an organization lobbying for religious exemptions in labor law. She let the numbers speak first. Then came the words. "These aren't just expenses," she said, steady, unforgiving. "They are access points. Each dollar was a key. Each invoice a locked door opened for someone who knew how to write a check and speak in hushed tones." She tapped a highlighted line on the document. "You didn't list these on your annual disclosure forms. Not once. Not when you traveled. Not when you ruled. Not even when the people funding these perks had cases before your bench." She turned to the committee now, letting the pages fall one by one across the table, each a silent indictment. "We expect judges to be human, but we do not expect them to be bought. We do not expect them to enter a courtroom already in someone's debt." Her voice rose, not with anger, but with the terrifying calm of someone laying down evidence so clear it could no longer be denied. Jasmine took a final document from the back of the binder, a cover memo from a whistleblower in the Judicial Conference of the United States, dated 6 months prior. It included a summary of 6 flagged, non-reportable events linked to Justice Alito, totaling over $170,000 in private benefits since 2010. None were declared. All were labeled as gifted services or hospitality, all from individuals or institutions with legal interest before the court. She held the paper high for a moment, then placed it squarely at the center of the desk like a judge placing a final ruling on the record. And then came her voice, sharp, final. "You have not been judging justice," Jasmine said, locking eyes with Alito, her words etched in steel. "You've been renting it, and then sending the bill to the trust of the American people." The line landed like a gavel to the throat. She didn't raise her voice, but the silence after made it deafening. No one shifted. No one scribbled. Even the camera stopped moving. Alito's face went pale, not from fear, but calculation. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what he could say that wouldn't make it worse, and Jasmine didn't give him the space to find it. "Every ruling you've handed down while accepting undisclosed luxury trips is tainted," she continued, "not because the ruling was necessarily wrong, but because the public will never know if it was yours or if it belonged to the men who poured wine beside you while whispering about legal frameworks." Her eyes swept across the room now. Senators, staffers, journalists, citizens. "This binder doesn't accuse you of illegality. It accuses you of disconnection. From the very people your decisions affect, from the very ethics your robe was meant to uphold, from the truth that justice is not yours to trade." She stepped back. The binder remained open. The receipts, frozen on screen, glared like open wounds. And in the silence that followed, something had changed, not just in the room, but in the air. Because this wasn't just about what Alito had done. It was about what the system had allowed him to believe he could get away with. And now he had been answered, not with rage, not with revenge, but with receipts and a single devastating truth. He hadn't judged the law. He'd billed it and left every American holding the check. The last sheet of paper lay open on the table, unmoving under the fluorescence. The room itself felt suspended, as if sound had been exiled and gravity had grown heavier with each second of stillness. Jasmine stood motionless, her eyes fixed forward, saying nothing more. Because there was nothing more to say. The binder of hidden receipts was still cracked open like a wound, its pages fanned like silent witnesses. And at the far end of the horseshoe table, Justice Samuel Alito did not move. The silence was not tactical. It was not reflective. It was stunned. His fingers, once tightly laced with the confidence of a man sure of his station, now hovered midair, like they'd forgotten what to do with themselves. His jaw tensed, but no words came. For the first time since he took the bench nearly 2 decades ago, Samuel Alito had nothing to say, and America was watching. From the gallery, journalists leaned forward with frozen pens and half-lit screens, unsure whether they were witnessing history or a collapse, or both. Cameras blinked red, silently recording every flicker of emotion. Alito's eyes drifted, not with composure, but with visible calculation. From the wall of press, to the rows of lawmakers, to the woman standing across from him who had just stripped his immunity bare. Not with fury, but with fact. He reached for his water glass, then pulled his hand back before touching it. An instinctive twitch, a man suddenly self-conscious of every motion. His shoulders rose slightly, as if to draw breath for a rebuttal. None came. Instead, his gaze fell downward, toward the folder in front of him, toward the numbers and the invoices and the silence that wrapped around them all like a noose. Jasmine hadn't moved since placing the final document down. She stood still, tall, eyes never leaving him. It was not triumph on her face. It was something far more dangerous to the powerful. Certainty, the kind that says, I didn't just expose what you've done. I've shown the world why you can't explain it. The chair of the committee didn't speak. No one cleared their throat. Even the hum of air vents seemed to pause. Across the country, Americans leaned closer to their televisions, their phones, their streaming feeds, watching the robe unravel. Some had doubted her. Many had expected a spectacle. But no one, not even her fiercest opponents, had expected this. The raw, unfiltered sight of a Supreme Court justice, confronted with evidence so precise, so damning, that even he could not craft a defense. The clock on the wall ticked once. Still no words. Still no breath. Still no denial. Outside the Capitol, anchors on live broadcast began falling into stunned pauses. On social media, clips of Jasmine's final line, "You didn't judge justice. You rented it," were already circling the globe. Some had already translated it. Others set it to music. But here, in this hearing room built for process and protocol, it was not a line. It was a verdict. And it left the most powerful man in the American judiciary wordless. Alito's lips parted slightly, then closed again. His face, usually carved from judicial stone, was now human in the worst way. Unsure, unguarded, cornered not by partisanship, but by proof. Because it wasn't about one trip, or one invoice, or even one vote. It was about what had never been said aloud until now. That the power to interpret law had been tangled, quietly, deliberately, with influence, comfort, and unaccountable privilege. And that someone had finally dared to speak it, not as a protester outside the gates, but from across the table. And worse, she had evidence. Jasmine finally broke her gaze, not to walk away, but to let the silence finish what truth had started. She reached down and gently closed the binder of financial disclosures. Then she looked to the chair, then to the nation. "Let the record reflect," she said calmly, "that Justice Alito has chosen not to respond." There was no malice in her voice, no satisfaction, just the finality of fact. And in that moment, the power dynamic was rewritten, not in statute, but in the air itself. She had the floor, he had the silence. A slow, involuntary exhale escaped Alito's nose, audible only because the room had become a vault. His eyes, glassy now, didn't lock on to anyone. Not Jasmine, not the chairman, not the press. They floated somewhere between awareness and retreat, as if part of him understood what had happened, and the other part still believed this would pass like every scandal had before it. But this wouldn't pass. Not this time. Because for the first time, it wasn't filtered through rumor or press leaks. It wasn't buried in legalese or brushed aside by prestige. It was laid bare by a woman he'd dismissed as junior, unqualified, beneath the weight of jurisprudence. A woman who hadn't raised her voice, who hadn't slammed her fist. She had only raised the receipts and let the country draw its own conclusion. And the country had. It was drawing it now, in real time, on every screen and live stream, in every text thread and news ticker. They weren't watching a hearing anymore. They were watching the fall of a man who had built his name behind stone columns and black robes, now cornered by truth in a room too bright to lie in. And in the silence, justice itself stared back. Not blind, not abstract, but human, clear-eyed, and for the first time in decades, not afraid. The silence still gripped the room like a tightened noose, but Jasmine didn't let it end in stillness. She didn't want this moment to be swallowed by bureaucracy or dulled by fatigue. She stepped forward one final time, as though carrying not a closing remark, but a verdict not yet spoken. Behind her, the binder lay closed. The receipts had already done their damage. Alito sat motionless, drained of rhetoric, the weight of exposure finally eclipsing the weight of rank. And yet Jasmine's voice didn't rise in triumph. It lowered, honed to a tone that demanded attention, not applause. "This hearing isn't about one man," she said, her gaze sweeping not just the bench, but the nation beyond it. "It's about a question we've been too afraid to ask for too long. What happens when those who interpret the law believe they are above it?" A hush followed, not because the room was unresponsive, but because everyone knew. They were nearing the edge of something irreversible. "Justice is not a title," she continued. "It's a contract between those with power and those expected to survive it." Her voice deepened, shoulders straight. "And that contract has been broken, not in theory, not in legalese, but in every unrecused vote, every undisclosed gift, every moment when comfort mattered more than consequence." She paused there, not because she needed the breath, but because the room did. And then, with a single step forward, she placed her hand on the committee table, grounding her closing words like a signature etched in stone. "We cannot force you to resign today, Justice Alito," she said, voice clear and ringing. "But we can force this country to look up from its distractions and see, truly see, what has been allowed to thrive behind the curtain of power." The tension broke not with a gasp, but with a shift. Lawmakers who had remained stone-faced now leaned forward. Reporters no longer typed, they stared. The press pool at the back of the chamber slowly rose, not by protocol but by instinct. Something irreversible had been spoken, and it hadn't come from the chair. It had come from a woman standing without permission, but with authority. And then came the line that would ripple across every television in America, every phone, every transcript, every memory. "Justice," Jasmine said, her voice trembling with control, "is not a name carved into marble steps. It is the voice of the silenced, rising through people brave enough to listen." The room froze, and then rose. Chairs scraped back. First one, then several, then all of them. Lawmakers, aides, even members of the press stood up, not because someone had signaled them to, but because they knew. This wasn't the end of a hearing. This was the beginning of something else entirely. The clapping started as a soft staccato, but it grew, not into a roar, but into a vow. One not written, not voted on, but felt. A promise that the old rules, where robes could shield corruption, where status could silence accountability, were cracking. Live. Alito sat still, eyes down. Not defiant now, just unready. Jasmine didn't soak in the applause. She didn't bow. She stepped back, gathered her notes, and walked from the microphone with the quiet composure of someone who knew she had said exactly what needed to be said, and not one word more. The next morning, long before the Capitol rotunda filled with tourists, a security guard stepped into the hearing chamber at 6:42 a.m. and paused. Mounted high on the left wall, between portraits of justices past and present, was a framed oil painting of Samuel Alito, commissioned 5 years earlier. Quiet, formal, dignified. But by 7:15 a.m., it was gone. No announcement was made, no press release, no explanation. Only a gap on the wall, and the silence of institutional response finally, awkwardly, catching up to public conscience. By noon, the footage of Jasmine's closing line had hit every major network. It was replayed on loop across CNN, MSNBC, and even on conservative outlets, many of which were suddenly uncertain of how to spin what had just happened. It wasn't a partisan attack. It wasn't a policy debate. It was a moral rupture, and everyone watching felt it. The quote was tweeted by sitting senators, reposted by Supreme Court scholars, printed on protest signs in front of the court by evening. Hashtags emerged, uncoordinated but unified. Marble is not justice. Voice of the silenced Crockett was right. Editorials followed. Some hailed Jasmine as the voice of a new judicial reckoning. Others, more hesitant, called for the creation of an enforceable Supreme Court ethics code. But in living rooms, lecture halls, and law schools across the country, one question kept returning. How long had this been going on? And why did it take a single woman, without robes or gavels, to speak what no one else dared? In Dallas, a woman sat on a worn couch in a modest one-bedroom apartment with the TV playing Jasmine's speech on loop. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just nodded once and whispered, "That's my daughter." The name on the 1996 indictment, the one Jasmine had held up the day before, was hers. By the end of the week, congressional inboxes had received more than 2.4 million emails demanding oversight hearings into judicial ethics. Protests formed outside state Supreme Courts from Denver to Atlanta. Law professors launched open letters. Ethics watchdogs circulated petitions, and a mural appeared overnight on a boarded storefront in Brooklyn, painted in bold white letters against a black backdrop. Justice is not marble. It's memory. JC. But perhaps the clearest sign that something had changed came not from headlines or hashtags, but from the court itself. At the end of the next oral argument session, when the justices stood to leave, one seat remained empty. No explanation was given. Justice Alito was not present. He would return later, yes, but something in his shadow had shifted. The weight of untouchability was no longer intact. And Jasmine? She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't sell books. She walked back into her office that Monday morning, greeted by a wall of flowers and letters and voicemails left on phones that had rung all night. But she didn't change course. She was never chasing headlines. She had come to remind the system of its own promise. And she had. Not with shouting, not with vengeance, but with truth so clearly spoken that it could no longer be ignored, even by the highest bench in the land. The gavel may never have dropped, but the impact had already struck. Long after the clapping had faded and the hearing room emptied, the tremors began. Quiet, slow-moving, but unmistakable. Inside the marble fortress of the Supreme Court, where time moved differently and tradition calcified faster than truth, there was now a ripple in the stone. It didn't crack the foundation. It didn't collapse the columns. But it changed how people walked through it, how they whispered, how they remembered what had happened that day in room 2141. Justice Alito returned to his chambers 3 days later. No fanfare, no statement, just the soft thud of polished soles on old floors and a door that closed with more weight than usual. His clerks noticed he no longer entered from the main rotunda. The justice's cafeteria, once a quiet meeting ground, grew quieter still when he walked in. Some greeted him out of obligation. Others couldn't meet his eyes. And those who had once leaned into his influence now leaned back, careful not to get caught in the undertow. Outside the court, it wasn't a scandal anymore. It was a shift in the national mood. Editorial boards changed tone. From defense to reckoning, legal blogs began publishing the timeline of unreported trips and dinners like they were mapping a crime scene. Law school deans were flooded with student emails. Why aren't we taught about judicial ethics enforcement? Panels were organized, syllabi rewritten. For the first time, Supreme Court accountability wasn't an abstract civic concept. It was a lecture title. The portrait that once hung outside the judiciary hearing room, the oil-rendered likeness of Justice Alito in full robes and quiet grandeur, had been quietly taken down. No plaque explained the absence, but the wall looked different now. Lighter, some said. Honest, said others. A visitor from Illinois told a reporter, "It feels like space just got cleared for someone who actually earned it." Meanwhile, the Senate Judiciary Committee, long gridlocked and often impotent in public eyes, found itself inundated with something unexpected. Hope. Letters, thousands of them, handwritten and digital, from veterans, single mothers, public defenders, even former inmates. Many began the same way. "I never thought anyone would say it out loud." And in response, legislation moved. Not quickly, not without resistance, but it moved. The Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act, once dismissed as political theater, began gathering bipartisan traction. It didn't call for impeachment. It didn't even name Alito. But it called for a financial disclosure standard for the Supreme Court equal to that of the House and Senate, a code of ethics with enforcement, a digital record of recusals and affiliations. For the first time in over 200 years, a real debate had begun. Should the highest court in the land remain the only one without rules it cannot be punished for breaking? Inside the court, the ripple grew. Justice Kagan made a quiet reference during a dissent, stating, "Public trust, once broken, is not a matter of press cycles. It is a matter of repair." Justice Jackson, newer, younger, unshaken, began receiving more requests to speak at law schools, especially those with students who had seen the hearing clip online and had, for the first time, felt that justice wasn't supposed to feel so distant. Alito, for his part, wrote fewer opinions. His name appeared less frequently on majority assignments. His voice during oral arguments, once curt, commanding, became careful, even tentative. He no longer interrupted the way he used to. Perhaps he was calculating. Perhaps he was simply tired. Or perhaps, as one former clerk whispered to Politico, he finally realized the robe doesn't cover everything. And yet, he was still there, still casting votes, still shaping lives. Because that's how power works in America. It doesn't disappear, it erodes. And every erosion begins with someone saying, "Enough." That someone had been Jasmine Crockett. And though she had no gavel, no robe, no marble office, she had something far more enduring. Proof, not just of corruption, but of clarity. A voice that had entered the most fortified chamber in American democracy and made it flinch. And in the eyes of a nation so long numbed by power's impunity, that flinch was a beginning, not a revolution, but a ripple in the marble. That would not stop. It should have ended with the cameras. That was the assumption, that the applause would fade, that the moment would shrink back into committee transcripts, clipped segments, think pieces, that Jasmine Crockett would return to being just a freshman congresswoman. Sharp, yes, but ultimately swallowed by the rhythm of a system that outlasted its challengers. But that's not what happened. Because something in that room hadn't just exposed a man, it had unlocked something. It began quietly, in places that rarely made the news. A courthouse in rural Alabama, where a young black public defender printed out Jasmine's quote and taped it to the back of her clipboard. "Justice is not a name carved into marble, it's the voice of the silenced." A classroom in Minnesota, where a civics teacher who had stopped believing in what he taught showed the hearing instead of a textbook and said, "This is the chapter they didn't print." A women's shelter in Arizona, where a mother with a felony conviction she'd never spoken about before whispered, "I think she was talking to people like me." Jasmine hadn't offered a rallying cry. She hadn't promised reform. She hadn't fed the machine of outrage. What she'd offered was far more dangerous to power: recognition. She had named what so many had felt for so long, that justice had stopped looking like them and had started speaking a language only the privileged could translate. And now they were answering back. The emails flooded her office, thousands by the hour, not from lobbyists, not from colleagues, but from people who had never spoken to a member of Congress in their lives. A welder in Michigan, a nurse in Houston, a retired bus driver in Newark who wrote, "I stayed alive long enough to hear someone finally say it out loud." Her staff had to install new servers to handle the influx. Volunteers stepped in to sort handwritten letters. Some came on torn paper. Others were folded napkins. One arrived scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt. They all began the same way. "Thank you." But it wasn't only the public that heard her. Inside government buildings, something quieter began. Judges began rechecking their financial disclosures. Law clerks whispered about recusal memos that suddenly couldn't be ignored. A state Supreme Court justice in Oregon stepped down unexpectedly, citing personal reasons. But insiders knew better. The timing was too precise, the pressure too new, the silence finally too loud to hide behind. One morning, Jasmine received a package without a return address. Inside was a framed photo, grainy black and white, A courtroom in Mississippi, 1965. A black woman being removed by two officers for speaking without being recognized by the bench. Behind the glass, a note: "You walked in so we could stand." No name, no location, just initials, ER. Jasmine placed it on her office wall, directly across from the Constitution. But even as she became a symbol, Jasmine remained Jasmine. She still rode the early train alone, still stopped at the same corner cafe in D.C., where the barista smiled wider now, but didn't charge her less. Still took late-night calls from her district. Constituents worried about rent, about ICE raids, about potholes. Power had brushed against her, but it hadn't taken root. She wouldn't let it. One evening, while walking home from the Capitol, she paused at a crosswalk near the Library of Congress. A girl, maybe 17, maybe 18, approached hesitantly, clutching a book to her chest. "Are you?" Jasmine smiled. "Yes." The girl didn't ask for a selfie, didn't ask for an autograph. She just said, "I saw what you did. I didn't think someone like you could be in there." Jasmine didn't blink. "I didn't think so either, until I was." Then the light changed, and they crossed together, two shadows moving toward a city still unsure of what to do with honesty. Meanwhile, Alito remained silent. He issued no statement, took no interviews. His public appearances grew fewer, his presence on opinions quieter. The court did not censure him. It couldn't. The Constitution didn't allow it. But the world around him changed regardless. Every ruling he authored now carried a footnote in the minds of the public. Every comment he made was parsed for partisanship. He was still a justice, but no longer untouchable. Jasmine hadn't removed his robe. She had made it transparent, and the marble no longer shielded him from the memory of that room. Because memory, once awoken, does not sleep again. 2 months later, Jasmine was invited to speak at Howard University School of Law. She declined twice. She wasn't ready. The third time, she said yes. She didn't bring a prepared speech. She stood behind the podium, looked at the room of young black and brown faces staring back at her, and said, "You don't have to raise your voice to shake a system. You just have to be willing to say what no one else will, and mean it." The room fell silent, and then, without prompting, they stood. Not for her title, not for her politics, but for her courage, the kind they had been told would never be enough, the kind that finally was. Late that night, Jasmine returned to her apartment. Her phone buzzed. Another message from a stranger. This one simply read, "They tried to bury your voice. They didn't know it was a root." She stared at the screen, then set the phone down. No tweet, no reply. She simply sat in the quiet and let the words land, because they were true, and because that voice, her voice, was never meant to be temporary. It was never just about a hearing, or a judge, or a vote. It was about something that couldn't be buried by silence or robes or time. Truth, when spoken with courage, does not echo. It expands. And now, it was everywhere. The words had landed. The echo had become a voice. And that voice, Jasmine's, had done something few believed possible. It had pierced marble. But long after the hearings faded from headlines, after the hashtags slowed and the lights in room 2141 dimmed once more, a deeper truth remained. It wasn't printed on placards or captured in viral clips. It couldn't be edited into a soundbite or stamped into law. It lived elsewhere, in the hearts of those who saw themselves for the first time standing across from power and refusing to blink. Because this story at its core was never just about corruption. It was about the silence that power depends on, and the people who choose to shatter it. The real lesson wasn't spoken at the microphone or written into legislation. It was hidden in the moments that came after. When Jasmine walked back to her office alone, past portraits of men who had shaped law without ever knowing what it was like to survive it. It was in the breath she took before facing 1,000 angry voices who said she had gone too far, that she should have stayed in her lane, lowered her gaze, played by the rules. But Jasmine had learned the first rule of the powerless. The rules were never written for you. And still, she stood. That's the first truth this story teaches us. Power protects itself through ceremony. But justice demands disruption. When institutions begin to believe that tradition is a substitute for transparency, they rot from the inside. When robes become armor and titles become shields, the people they claim to serve are no longer protected. They are pacified. Jasmine refused to be pacified. She refused to let silence be interpreted as respect. She reminded a nation that respect without accountability is just reverence for the wrong things. The second truth is more dangerous and more human. Justice doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, quietly, incrementally. A lunch not reported, a vote not recused, a plane ticket offered without question, a flag flown over a house when no one is supposed to be looking. It happens slowly beneath the threshold of outrage. And by the time the public sees it, it's already carved into the architecture. Jasmine didn't just point to the cracks, she showed how they were designed to be invisible. But here's the cost. When you expose what's been hidden that long, you don't just face resistance, you face erasure. They tried to discredit her, called her dramatic, called her unprofessional, unfit, angry, but she never raised her voice. She only raised the stakes, and that's what they feared most. Because in a world that teaches people like her to survive quietly, the loudest sound is a woman who doesn't flinch when the system flinches first. And that brings us to the third lesson, perhaps the most painful. Truth alone isn't enough, not in the halls of power, not in the courts, not even in the court of public opinion. Jasmine laid out facts, receipts, memos, recordings. She built a case stronger than many that had resulted in convictions. But no resignation followed. No robe was removed. The system didn't collapse. It recalibrated. It tightened its grip. And yet, that didn't mean she failed, because justice is not always measured by what changes the next day. Sometimes it's measured by what can never be unseen again. A generation watched that hearing. They saw justice tremble. They saw the mask slip. They saw for once that proximity to power didn't mean submission to it. And that shift, quiet, powerful, irreversible, is how all real change begins. There's a reason why they tried to reduce Jasmine to one voice. Because one voice is the most dangerous thing a broken system can face. A single voice backed not by ambition, but by clarity, by memory, by loss. By growing up in a house where the law was not a protector, but a threat. By holding the indictment of your mother in your hands and realizing it was printed by the very system now asking for your silence. Jasmine spoke because no one had spoken for her when it mattered most. And in doing so, she became the voice for those who still can't speak at all. That is the human lesson of this story. You do not need permission to tell the truth. You only need the courage to survive its consequences. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.